American Ending is a beautiful novel. It's set during the 20th century, early 20th century, in America, in a Russian family or a family of Russian immigrants who are a community of miners. It's not really the most obvious connector to Charles Dickens. It's a different time, it's a different country. But when I read this book, it was so beautifully Dickensian in the way it's written, the way things are described, the prose. And I really wanted to speak to its author, Mary Kay Zuravleff, because I was really struck by just how almost deeply rooted in Dickens this book was. And it got me thinking about how many books there must be and stories there must be across the world that could be totally unrelated to Dickens in many respects. They could be science fiction books or fantasy books or books about the medieval past. And yet, all of whom are in some way inspired by Charles Dickens. And in a way, that's inevitable. Charles Dickens has become such a huge figure in English literature that if you're going to write stories, you really probably are drawing on Charles Dickens in some way, even if you're not intentionally doing it. Fortunately, Mary Kay Zuravleff was very intentionally doing it, and so it was really fascinating to speak to her about this new book, but also about what it was that drew her to write this story, and how did she take inspiration from Charles Dickens and his novels. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and as always, if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions, do drop us a line on events@dickensmuseum.com. Here's Mary Kay Zuravleff. On one hand, it's set in a very specific time and place in Mariana in the early 20th century in America, and yet it just felt so alive, and it felt very relevant to today, and dare I say, very Dickensian. So here to have a little conversation about her new book, and indeed how Dickens has helped perhaps inspire it, is our very own author, Mary Kay. Very welcome to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm just so grateful to Jordan Evans Hill and to Sarah Ridley and to the Dickens Museum. And those of you online should come to the Dickens Museum in London. It's really a treat. It's a beautiful, beautiful house museum where he actually lived and actually wrote Oliver Twist. And I'm going to read from the very beginning of the book, just a couple pages, because everyone says, why is it called American Ending? And why is there a wolf on the cover? So I'm just going to read to you from the very beginning so you can hear the voice of the narrator. This book is written from the point of view of Yelena, who is her family's first American. She's in Mariana, Pennsylvania, which is a coal mining community. And this is 100 years ago. This is a little more than 100 years ago. This is 1908. And what's the most American trait that she could have? Well, it's to close the door behind her and not let anyone else in, unfortunately. So I want you to hear her voice. I hoped the sisters I'd never met would never join us. And when they did arrive, I wanted to send them back. That's how American I am. As far as I was concerned, my parents had left the two of them behind and come here to give birth to me. What do you want, a medal? My little brother used to ask. He was born here, but I was born first. Where I was born isn't how I was raised. Though I hailed from Mariana, Pennsylvania, I was brought up hearing that wolves talk and old believers rise from the dead, that a good woman can make soup from a stone and a good man's snot is black with coal dust. I'm American, so I figured I didn't have to take what comes the way Ma and Pa did. Our kind of Russian Orthodox is called old believers because they don't believe in making changes or choices. But I aimed to choose some things for myself. That included a life away from the mines, where most of the men who aren't crushed or gassed end up dead from drink. For years, I was at Ma's apron strings, pickling beets and cucumbers alongside her, boiling diapers, rendering lard for soap. Yelena, 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 she'd say. What kind of mother leaves her daughters behind? It was a riddle where the answer was my kind of mother. She didn't leave the family icon behind, or prayer books her father had copied by hand, or spools of brocade to turn any shirt into a shirt fit for church. She even brought over a tin of ashes scooped from their tumble-down hearth, given that every family has a domovoi who lives in the stove, and better the devil you know. A few plump raisins set out overnight, and the domovoi would at most hide our slippers or let the fruit flies in. Each night, Ma uncoiled her braided bun and dropped hairpins in her lacquered box, painted with Emilion and his magic pipe. She shook out her golden plates, never cut, because that was a sin, and carried them like the train of a dress into our room, letting go so she could hoist our stack of covers. She tucked the heavy wool blanket beneath our chinny chin chins and perched on our bed, careful not to sit on her hair. Rubbing her swelling belly, she asked us, Russian ending or American ending? Bedtime was the only time I felt sympathy for my big sisters, knowing that Ma and Pa had slipped away one day from Suwalki without them. It was hard to sleep stewing over that, and I worried that my parents might want to begin again. Every scrape I heard was the trunk being dragged from under their bed. Every squeak, the wagon carting them away from us. That was a Russian ending, and Ma's fairy tales were worse. For every wish come true, there was a catch, and you could easily end up worse off than where you started. She told us about the wolf who promised the bride a ride to her wedding if she climbed on his back, and instead, he ate her. Eyelash to toenail, Ma growled, tickling us three. My brother, Kostya, flailing to escape, smacked baby Pearl, who sprayed tears like a watering can. Russian ending, everyone suffer, Ma said, and soothed our baby sister. I'll give you American ending for my tender American children. She said tender the way the wolf might. American ending meant the groom slicing open the wolf's belly and the bride jumping out unharmed. Her baba skinned the wolf and used the pelt to line their firstborn's cradle. I heard it from the bride herself, Ma said. I danced at the wedding and I ate their soup. She was proud of the cheery ending she'd tacked on. Ma and Pa had come here to seek their fortune. And instead of Ma getting her girls back, she got me. Then Kostya, then Pearl, and now another one coming. She hadn't seen her older daughters in 10 years. I didn't think we were suffering, but we weren't tender either. So I just want you to hear her voice. The entire novel is narrated by her. She's 9 years old at that point, and the book goes from when she's 9 to 20.
I often find when it comes to historical fiction, particularly in Britain, it's always the Tudors, it's kings and queens, it's earls and duchesses. And what I love is when you just get that really earthy, this is an ordinary family living amongst extraordinary times. And actually, there's all these legal changes and there's things going on in the wider world, the First World War in your book. But it's just those ordinary reactions to them and their daily lives and how they're impacted by shapings that they don't really control. And I absolutely love that.
And in fact, one of the reasons to do that is not finding their story on the bookshelf. So the Tudors have been well documented, and there are many, lives of famous people. And so I'm looking on the bookshelves to see, where are my folks? And Toni Morrison, our wonderful novelist Toni Morrison, says, if your people aren't on the bookshelf, you have to write that book. Yeah. So that was amazing to go then and talk to the people in Mariana and in Erie, and be a little bit nervous that they might say, not who are you to tell this story, because it's definitely my family, but you got this wrong, you got that wrong. We talked a little bit about research. And it was such a joy because in both places they kept saying, you saw us, you captured us. And in Mariana, they were saying, I'm not Russian, but I live next door, and we called her Baba, and we ate her blintzes and her skunts, and we celebrated Russian. And your great aunt once gave my great uncle a ride, and it made all the difference in the world. Like these acts of generosity and inclusion and community that were really exciting to hear. And then one man said to me, "Did your people ring the church bell? Because I live next to the church." So his association wasn't as positive.
Yeah. But that was really beautiful. And actually, I remember reading the book again, and this is what when I did the introduction, talking about this idea of it's set in a very specific place and time, but actually it kind of transcends that. And actually, particularly with your characters, I very much felt you recognize these characters, even though they're burly Russian miners, and of course, I don't live in Mariana in these Orthodox communities, but you really feel these characters are real. You recognize the personalities and the traits. And I wanted to ask you a bit about how much you wanted to kind of take on class, because I think class is a huge thing in your book. And what you really get a sense of as Yelena goes through life is her almost confronting the reality that she's brought. And it's almost like she doesn't really quite know it to begin with. But then the more she grows up and the more she goes into life, she starts to feel what her place is and really gets quite angry because she wants more, understandably.
She wants a choice. And she is in a life that has no choices. As a young woman, in this religion, in this community, she's expected to leave school in 4th grade. When her sisters finally come over, they can't feed those 2 more mouths. But what do? They marry them off. Now she's responsible for helping to take care of their children. And so, she so badly wants a choice in her own life. And that word isn't even in their vocabulary. Yeah. So that was something that I really struggled with, because you could write that from a 21st century perspective, where you're kind of judging and pointing out again and again, why not? Why did they treat? But I'm so glad you said what you said. And I take that as a huge compliment, because the goal was just to have her in it. She doesn't have to explain her religion. It's her religion. It says, it's like explaining my left arm to you. And likewise for the town, this is where she was born. And she wants people to see her as American. Nobody sees her as American. And she thinks one day, oh, well, I go to a Russian Orthodox church. I live on Russian Hill. And, my parents don't speak English very well. Of course, they don't see me as American. But in her head, she is American, and she should be seen that way. She's not even seen, really. Yeah, that was so hard to not explain and just live it. A friend of mine said after one draft of many, people in historical novels don't know they're in historical novels. Oh, darn. Because that's such a great point. Yeah, so to try to stay out of my way. But also the timeliness of it. I'm writing about immigrants who have been brought over for hard labor, dangerous labor, and when they're killed, they just bring over more immigrants for that job, and they're kind of dissed in every which way. You probably know the phrase, "owe my soul to the company store." So they're paid in scrip and not cash. My mom's mother marched into the foreman's office and demanded that my grandfather be paid in cash, because she was not going to shop at the company store. So they want to try to get out of there. There's no way out. Who do they belong to? Are they allowed to leave and get a different job? And I'm typing this, and then here's the pandemic coming down the pike in 1919, and I'm typing this, and it's 2020. And instead of 1919, I type 2019. And I just leapt back from the keyboard, because so much of the discussions we were having about refugees and immigration and what was fair and the census were exactly the same conversations they've been having for 100 years.
Once you make that discovery, then, did you kind of consciously go down that road of sort of trying to draw links with modern America? Or was that more of a subconscious
You don't
thing?
have to consciously. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to. One interviewer said to me, "It seems like you are your grandmother's American ending." It's like, oh, I love that, because I had the luxury of going to college. I had the luxury of saying, I'm going to be a writer, which would be ridiculous in her generation, right? She didn't have the luxury of going to 5th grade. So my parents thought it was absurd to study the arts. That would just, practice as an artist, because that wasn't their reality. And so that luxury was not present then. Yeah.
And it's really, I have to say, those themes I just felt were utterly Dickensian. I mean, I really got a sense, particularly when Elaine is young in the story at the beginning part of it, when she's only a sort of child, you almost feel that sense of Little Oliver Twist, or Dickens's book Gone Astray, where he kind of gets lost as a child and he's kind of going to take on the big city, and he has this sort of almost childish hope that isn't going to come true because he's a little kid lost in London. But you really felt that sort of Dickensian sense of here's this kind of plucky heroine who wants to take on the world despite the challenges.
Despite. And as an author, you don't want it to just be one horrible thing after another. And so there's family, there's church. I mean, there's food, lots of food. There's tradition, and all of those things bring about joy. At one point, the mother says, "We're just like the Pilgrims," because they're learning about Thanksgiving in school. Pilgrims come over here; they're already in debt, they're already dying off at a fast clip, and they leave because they can't practice their religion. So the Jews are treated horribly in Russia and Poland, and the Russian Orthodox are treated the next horribly, and all the priests are killed at one point. So they consider themselves persecuted, and so they open their house to have a Thanksgiving, and they don't have a piece of bread to eat. So to have Thanksgiving is a big darn deal, and it turns out that everybody kind of shows up at their house. Oh, here, I have some cherries I canned. I had like the stone soup story. The community really contributes. You're having a teacher over? Oh, okay, I can bring you this. I can bring you poppy seed cakes.
I love that scene, actually, the Thanksgiving scene. And I felt that really reminded me again of Dickens, because Dickens, as we know, uses food. Food is not just a thing in his stories. They have such significance to the emotional sense of the character, to the class position of the character. And I just felt that was something that you really did play with in your story. Again, was that quite a conscious choice to?
Well, yes. I mean, food is such a part of our tradition. And I've loved people saying to me, "Oh, my family, not coal miners, not Russian, but Chinese, and the dumplings my mother made. And that, what a big deal this holiday was." And then the next person comes up and says, "Oh, in my Jewish family, we have, oh, you call them pierogies. We call them, there's sort of an equivalent. Blintzes are the same as crepes, are the same as tortillas, almost. Tortillas aren't sweet, but blintzes have a little bit of sugar in them." And so, everybody's got that portable sandwich for the worker. And then I was reading the book aloud for the audiobook, and my sound engineer was a young woman who was of Polish American descent. And after the first chapter, she said, "Oh, you're making me so hungry. These are all the foods we had growing up, with just a little bit of a difference." So food and smell reach so far back into our past. Yeah. But then also, I mean, these people are just about starving. And that's a link to writing fiction versus nonfiction. They keep Lent 6 weeks before Christmas, 6 weeks before Easter, every Wednesday and Friday, and every Saint's Day. And Lent is no milk, no meat, no dairy, no eggs. And I was writing that, and I was thinking, oh, well, they don't have that often, not during Lent. I wonder if they made some of those rules to turn the sort of, poverty into piety. And I called my mom and I said, "I just had this." And that's the difference between writing fiction, where you get to reflect on it. And my mom said, "I bet they did. I bet they did make that rule." So that was really interesting. People said, "Why didn't you write it as nonfiction?" I wanted to combine the two families because it was too many people moving around in time. But I also got to ask those questions that when you're in it, you don't ask. It's just your life.
That's really interesting. One of the other things that I loved is you have this plethora of characters, and some of
many fewer than we started with.
Yeah, well, that's actually what I was going to ask, because some of them, might only come in and out of the story for maybe a couple of pages, but they have got such a strong presence that you can't forget about them. And this is such a Dickensian trick.
That's so Dickens. That's just so Dickens. I mean, he's brilliant at that.
From him, you've got kind of Miss Flight and Bleak House, or you've got Miss Wade and Little Dorrit. These are characters that are not necessarily the main characters, but they kind of, you can't forget about them, and you're drawn to them constantly. And so they cast huge shadows over the narrative. And I have to ask, how much time did you spend writing backstories for all of your little characters?
Well, many of them didn't get as much time on the stage as they had in earlier drafts, and many people were voted off the pages because it was a lot of people, and the names were throwing people, the Russian names, and everybody has a nickname. So, I mean, I had a running gag. Olga is a very popular name because she's the big saint, and you're named, you get a saint's name. So at one point, Elena had two friends named Olga, the two Olgas, and I really got a kick out of that, but nobody else was getting a kick out of that. So there are some things you do for your own amusement. But Dickens is just brilliant at inventing the comic character, the evil, mean, sinister character, and then the through line. Who is this person that keeps popping up every 3 chapters, and why are they important to this book? And I saw the locket, and I saw that, oh, what's going on? So the piquing your curiosity character who's vivid enough to keep in your head, but hasn't shown their worth in the narrative yet. I love that. So it's like a mystery. And so I have to say that I would go back to that. Like, how did he do that? Because you don't just want them to be stereotypes or caricatures. And there's a young woman is sent with her sister's name, Shenya. And Shenya's, in my mind, very vivid. And she will tell Yelena the true answer to questions that Yelena will boldly ask her. So that's valuable. And then she moves away. And when it's time for Yelena to try to get herself out of Mariana, you think, maybe Shenya will help you. And so you get that opportunity to bring her back and have her be a continuing influence in her life. And that was fun. It's like, let's call on her. And this is something I wanted to talk about. So I'm glad we got here. As a young reader of Dickens and a new writer who wants to invent and have a giant cast, sometimes his work seemed way too coincidental. Oh, all of these ridiculous opportunities that are going to make themselves known. And then I've come to so appreciate them. And we've been here a couple weeks. So one day we go out to tea at the beautiful Theatre Royal. And there are 2 gentlemen obviously celebrating something. There's flowers there. And so at one point we strike up a conversation as we're all leaving. And darn if he doesn't live in one of the houses that Charles Dickens lived in, and he got the plaque for the house. And that's just a Tuesday. That's just a day in London meeting a stranger. And then we're on the train and we take over a table for 4 that one man has sat in, and there's 3 of us, and sorry. And he says, no, I love your American accent. Where are you from? He's very friendly and sweet. He's a magician who, as it happens, performed in New York once, and his friends took him into Trump Tower, where he ordered a couple coffees, and Donald Trump walked over to him in 2010 and said, I love your accent. I'll buy your coffees. And we said to him, you could have done something in 2010 that might have scared us. But I mean, that's a crazy coincidence. 3 Americans get on a train in London, and a magician tells them he met Donald Trump before he became president. So then you think, wow, and in this book, her parents come from all the way from Suwalki on a train, on a boat, then on another train, then by cart. And the house they're shown is attached to neighbors they had in Suwalki, who they did not know were here. And the Americans say, small world. The Russians say, the world is cramped. Same sentiment, but Russian.
Yeah, absolutely. But one of the questions I wanted to talk to you about was about the role of religion in the book, because it's quite fascinating, because Yelena, again, she's just such an interesting character that you've created, and she's got this she's not irreligious at all, she's very sincere in her faith, but at the same time, she's quite questioning of the structures of it. The priest kind of tells them to do things, but doesn't really explain why, and she sort of thinks, well, why doesn't he just explain things to me? And I thought that was really interesting. It was very modern, but at the same time, it kind of chimes with a lot of Dickens' own relationship with religion, where he kind of is religious, he goes to church, he's a Christian, but he's very critical of the church at other points where he feels it's failing to kind of help the poor. And I just wondered, what was your kind of reflections on the role of the church, as it were, as you came to write the book?
Yeah, it was complicated because I was raised in it, but not there. And I was not trying to diss the church or in any way show it in a bad light. And yet it's a very fundamentalist religion with a million rules. It is a house built of rules with no logical reason. It's religion. It doesn't have to be logical. And there are things like, well, you cannot smoke because your body is a temple and you wouldn't want to harm it. But you can drink because the first miracle was turning water into wine. And so, it doesn't really make much sense. And women can't cut their hair, but men can, so it goes on and on like that. And Yelena is bright and vivacious and loves to learn. And she keeps saying, but how come? But how come? No, you don't. And that's another interesting thing of people saying to me, thank you for explaining some of the church to me. If you don't even know the language of it, we do this because we do this. And we do this because in some ways, in all ways, the church united them. You help out other people in the church. They didn't starve because of the other people in the church. And so it was a great help and a comfort in a lot of ways. But it also told you who to marry. And it also told you that, oh, your son is now this old. He goes into the mine too. That's not religion, that's family. And boy, are they intertwined. Who does what and why. Yeah, the religion doesn't say you marry at this age. The religion doesn't say that. And yet it begets that.
And it's that sense of almost, again, it kind of goes back to our conversation earlier about power, doesn't it? I thought, again, Dickens writes a lot about where there is hypocrisy found within sort of positions of authority, particularly within the church. And I thought it was really interesting with the priest in that town, where, obviously he's this huge authority figure, and yet they found out halfway through the book he's not even a real priest. And actually he has to then be rededicated as a priest. So again, you capture that sense of...
Yeah, and she's thinking, you've been telling me what to do all this time, and you've been punishing me. She's just had her first confession, which is not a pretty sight. And, they're held accountable for everything. Oh, did you ever steal? Confession is the only thing that's been in English so far, except for Sunday school. No, I never steal. You didn't take a crumb off the table. You didn't take an extra piece of bread when your mother said enough. All right, add it to the list. So he's just dealt out this punishment to them through confession, and then she discovers he's not even a real priest. So who's the one who's a liar here? Yeah. So who is making these rules? And that goes for the country, and that goes for the church and the community. So and the family. Who is the entity that is taking all her choices away? And how is she going to be able to have any voice in her own life? So one interviewer said to me, oh, she's so rebellious. And I said, no, she isn't. She does every single thing that's expected of her. But she's trying to figure out, in this system, how could I have some voice, which women have been trying to figure out for years and years and years. Yeah. I don't want to be ostracized from this family. I don't want to be excommunicated from this church. And yet.
And that's, again, really interesting in times. I know there was, we spoke at the museum recently about Dickens in the 1830s. There was a movement to close down anything basically that wasn't work on a Sunday. And of course, the upshot of that would have been that poor people couldn't have gone and done anything on a Sunday. They couldn't have gone out for dinner. They couldn't have gone to the restaurant.
Their only day off.
Their only day off. They worked the rest of the week. And so Dickens was scathing about this and wrote, several articles condemning it. One of which I have to say was brilliant, because he actually wrote it effectively to the Bishop of London, and sort of got quite cheeky about it. So again, that sense of they're not trying to overthrow the world order, but they're trying to question it and think, actually, let's focus on people like poor people growing up, wanting to do the right thing, and let's do the right thing by them as well.
So. Well, we went to the V&A, which, what's more beautiful than the V&A? And they have those dining rooms for the working man, which were open later and are exquisitely decorated, William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones. And, the working man should have beauty. The working man should, and I've been working in museums. I worked in the Smithsonian for years and years. And, there's that threshold about who is this for and what times are you open and who can get there. And so to open the V&A late and have these beautiful, I found it very moving. I was really touched.
So final question for me.
Yes.
Obviously, we know, because of people like Dickens, that literature does have this incredible ability to change perceptions, to change hearts and minds, to have an impact in the world. What do you think about literature generally, and what do you hope people will get after reading your book?
Well, I sort of feel like literature is my religion. It's so important to me. And, I think of Dickens as writing, shining a light in places where people hadn't, the plight of, as you were saying, classes who had not been given their due or were really put upon. And in this book, both letting these folks be on the bookshelf, but also hearing people say, I have to tell you my family story. I have to tell you what they went through. And by way of example, there was this young man who interviewed me whose grandfather, unbeknownst to him, had snuck in from Mexico. He'd been raised in a very tony suburb of Washington, D.C., and his grandfather was a surgeon. So he did not know anything about this. But before he died, his grandfather said, I have to tell you this. And about where he had been excluded and how. And Max was really moved. And I was saying to him, isn't that interesting that you never knew it? Your grandfather could have gone to his grave. There's no shame in his story. And yet he felt shame and still did not want to go to his deathbed without telling. And that mix of like pride and shame, I have to tell you where I came from. And don't forget this. I mean, that's just fascinating to me. And that has been the offshoot of sharing this story with others, is people saying, oh my gosh, I'm going to go home and call my grandmother and turn on the phone and record her. Or I'm going to look into, or I know that these folks are from here, but my husband is a genealogist. So we've been kind of a tag team to reading groups that have said to us, this has really made a priority of capturing our family's particular struggle. Or, like I said, amazing acts of generosity. Some of the stories are just incredible. My grandfather had $1 and somebody did this for him and it allowed him to stay or get married or, yeah. So that's been, I guess, the power of this book for me has been actually hearing other people's stories and begetting other people to capture them.
That's really beautiful. Well, thank you so much. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I know I certainly enjoyed being part of it. Remember that season 2 of Inimitable comes out in October, so there's not too long to wait until you get the full Charles Dickens series. In the meantime, if you have any questions, perhaps you've got some burning question about Dickens that you'd love us to answer in season 2, do get in touch at events@dickensmuseum.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thoughts, comments, questions. We really want to hear from you. So do get in touch, events@dickensmuseum.com.